That's how you can get a death of a civilization. Threads that if you start pulling them, this entire thing becomes unraveled. It's a conversation of data legitimacy. Nearly every platform is lying about their data attribution. The tone that people discuss this in is more of inevitability. Craft something new that's not just leveraging the old iconography, and it needs to be something that is vital and interesting. Even communism and fascism are far more alike. Once you understand how ancient people live, it's a foreign country.
All right, this is Illegitimate Scholar, episode 64, something like that. And I'm here with Dimes, who does Blood Satellites. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. If you're not, I guess my first question for you would be, why is your show called Blood Satellites?
That's a good question. And we used to get asked it a lot more. So there's a couple different versions of the story. My co-host, Judas, who's not here, unfortunately, but he has a slightly different one. My memory is just, it was an inside joke between me and my friend groups. It started off by saying that it was something to the tune of, we were going to keep our legacy alive by having our blood orbit the Earth in a satellite. And then people would hear that, and then they would hear Blood Satellite, but not that explanation, and start concocting all their own answers about it's a blood and soil thing, or apparently, I didn't know this, apparently a blood satellite's also like a forensic description of a blood splatter from, a murder. So it's like a murderous thing. So yeah, there's a lot of like extreme interpretations, but it really is just some dumb.
Yeah, it usually is. It usually is.
Because it's also, why is there a dollar sign in the title? Yeah, exactly.
What, same reason? Like it just...
Yeah, it's just funny. I like money and I like dollars.
Yeah, me too. The symbol of the podcast is basically a banana. Like for Jay Burden, people drop the beaver emojis in the chat, and for me, they do the bananas, and that's just because there's a book about bananas being like a sacred fruit and how they yes, sacred fruit in a lot of cultures, but also like the banana is super specific in how it reproduces, and it's different from all other plants. It's a great book. If you listen for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, I love anytime the chat just takes it and does it on their own. That's something that's really special to me. Because in my professional life, I work in marketing. And so that's something that marketers have always tried to capture. It's that virality, and they've never done it because they can't. But they always try and mimic some kind of popular upswell, people doing a thing on their own, like a miracle. And then, so I spent my entire career watching people try to replicate that. And it just can't.
Like you try, it just doesn't work. It's like giving yourself a nickname.
And I've known people who tried to do that. They tried to do that. That's why I got Dimes. I didn't give myself that. That's how you know it's honest, because it's, again, some dumb shit.
Yeah. It really is. It always is. I got called Sparky for a month because I short-circuited a whole fob. But
that's a classic nickname too.
Seriously.
That's one that that's kind of cool too, but it's got a story behind it.
Yeah, exactly. So marketing, I just saw this thing on Instagram. I thought it was a brilliant marketing campaign. So the story behind it, and I'm not sure it's true. I think it probably is because, like you said, they never come up with this on their own. But there's this woman, young woman, probably like, I don't know, early 20s. And her company has it's like a drink company. I don't know. I don't remember the name. I have her followed on Instagram now, though. And their whole marketing team, she started an Instagram where all she did was smash the cans of this thing in a bunch of creative ways and creating these videos on Instagram. And 6 months in, she's got over 100,000 followers. And in the descriptions is my boss says, if I get to 500,000 followers, he'll give me a promotion or something. But now
my boss said if I get 500,000 followers, he'll suck my toes. That's why she's getting there. A woman smashing X is going to get you 1 million followers, and it's the wrong type of people. You don't want those.
Well, apparently they're getting more sales on their drink. I don't know though. They might have to rebrand towards this intern, but I bet that she's better at marketing than everybody else in the firm. Everyone else in the firm. It's a drink company, but they have a whole marketing department.
It is hovertising, and there's a value attached to that. And there's like all these ways, if people watch YouTube videos or they're into like homesteading videos or they're into like the gun community, people will have noticed that the thumbnails for these YouTube videos started incorporating really just tarted up women that have nothing to do with the video. They're literally just there to get clicks. And then it's just some guy teaching you about the new fucking SAS or something.
And it works.
It does.
It works.
It works on me every single time. It's not going to work on me.
Yeah. Yeah. She doesn't even she's not like dressing provocatively or doing anything, but she is a young, attractive woman and she's out there doing it. But her campaign is funny. Like, it's also funny. Like, she's like hitting the can with golf clubs and stuff. And then the actual page is just some corporate BS thought up by somebody with no creativity.
The best part is she might have come up with that herself too, because that almost doesn't sound like something that came from an agency or a marketing department. It sounds a bit too funny and random for like a room of 6 of the most dull people you could possibly imagine to come.
It would never get past it. Like, someone would bring up that idea and they would be like, yeah, let's circle back to that. And then they never would, even though it's better than anything they came up with. And an intern did it. An intern. I don't know if she's being paid. I hope so.
They would overthink it. All of these ideas, it's, designed by committee. But everyone talks about like movie designed by committee, but imagine an idea designed by a committee. It's the worst thing you've ever thought.
Yeah. It's because nobody would individually come up with it. So it's just not even human relatable, because it's not. It's made up by a conglomerate, an aggregor.
Well, because I could just say, before I know we got to probably move on to other stuff, but I would say if that idea were pitched in a boardroom, the first thing they would say is, okay, but does it need to be our product? Can it be it can't be a competitor's product. Okay, what if they just what she smashes things? Oh, what if she smashes the patriarchy? And then here we go. And then you can't say that's a bad idea. You're not allowed to say it's a bad idea. So now you've designed the worst thing you've ever seen.
Yeah, seriously. But no, it seems like she just came up with this on her own and she just smashes the can. And there's a million ways to smash a can. And it's one thing and people know what they're getting. So they come back for it. Smashing cans. So the first thing I wanted to bring up to you is I saw you on with somebody and you were talking about this idea of these like crypto states. And I'd love to go over that with you because it's such like a, I talk about on the podcast a lot, the differences in how people organize themselves and how that's related to not the level of technology, but what technology they have. Like, the traditional, if you listen to modern psychology and anthropology, it's like 150 people is like the natural carrying capacity of humans.
Yeah. They call that Dunbar's number, I believe. It's around like 120 to 150, something like that.
Yeah. There's a bunch of evidence for why this is a thing. And I find it pretty convincing. Personally, I'm not saying I don't, but it's like this is a tribe or a collection of tribes that would be broken up into a bunch of bands that are extended family groups, and that would meet up, and then maybe they meet up with some other people at other times, like specific times.
And just to drill into that a little bit, the Dunbar's number, the description, I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but it was something like it's the amount of people that you can have a meaningful relationship with, where it's not just like you're an acquaintance or you're aware with, like the maximum amount of people you can have a direct one-to-one good relationship with. That's about the level of a tribe, and tribe is the word they will constantly use.
Yeah. And tribe gets sometimes like, the definition of a tribe goes like so much more broad now. Like you'll have a Native American tribe, but really it's like thousands of people or even more than that. Whereas that's more than a tribe. A tribe is, in anthropology at least, in the contextual definition, it's much lower. Once you get up to the level of like a chiefdom, then there's more political complexity. There's rules for There's rules for who gets the leadership afterwards, whereas like in tribes and bands, it's generally leadership just by what's the word? It's a consensus. It's like there are obviously like values that any specific society has. It's based on their environment, but the actual reason that people follow that person is not it's not official. It's not like there aren't like bureaucratic rules behind it.
Yeah, it's not litigated. It's like pre-constitution, and a constitution might actually, or a Magna Carta or some other document might emerge from that, but this predates that. And in case I don't get to mention this later, I'm sure you're familiar with this book and many of the listeners, but I was just reading this book, and we'll get to the network state in just a second, but this ties into that. I was just reading this book that I got to very late, and I wish I didn't because it's so good. The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. It's one of these books where every single page, it's got something fascinating on it. But he was describing what a collapse is. What is a civilizational collapse? And we think of that. We think the entire thing is decimated and falls into ruin. But he describes it, and I think this is more realistic. I'd be curious to hear what you say, of just more of a stepping down in complexity. So what's interesting is a lot of the times when a complex state falls, it actually just reverts back to its maybe founding tribal orientations. It doesn't just dissipate entirely. Oftentimes it goes back to the tribes who then maybe scatter, but it's just like a lower resolution, sometimes on purpose or by design, rather than it just disappears one day. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, so this is actually perfect, because what I was about to say is that leadership is contextual. And in the sense of like a hunter-gatherer society, you're not going to have these official rules. I'll do a middle example, though. Like in Rome, in the Roman Empire, you would have these consuls, or I'm sorry, pre-Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. You have these consuls, but the consuls are only given military power and this tyrannical power before tyrannical became a negative term. It's a neutral term of a tyrant. They would get this power when they needed to have it, and then they would give it up, right? And this is one thing that heavily inspired our own constitution. And in hunter-gatherer societies, oftentimes what you'll have is that for certain times of the year and certain situations, certain people will be in charge, and then in a different time, someone else will be in charge. In the 17th century in New England, there was this war, Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War. And this war was like, it was the war that killed the largest proportion of the American population at any time. Obviously, it's pre-actual United States, but it killed a 2, 3, 4% of the European derived population of the United States. It was a complete annihilation war on both sides between the New England Confederation, the New England colonies, and their native allies versus most of the rest of the natives in New England. As southern New England mostly is where it happened. And the leadership of this guy, King Philip Metacom, he was somebody who was not in charge for most of his life. He was a warlike dude. He was very violent, and he was judged to be he wasn't right for leadership at any other time. But he becomes right for leadership at the time when they need that type of thing. And leadership is contextual in that sense. Like when you need a certain person, you do one thing. When you need someone else, you use someone else. In the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, they have the consuls. They get tyrannical power when there is a war where they need to be in charge, or there's some sort of crisis. And there's elements of that we have in our country today. But the other part of this is that when you have a civilization, like you were talking about, a stepping down in power towards a lower power level of a complex society, oftentimes in socially constructed countries, and I say the word socially constructed, I got to write about this because people hear the word social construct and it's like left-wing coded. But in anthropology, all social construct means, and how I use it, is there's this distinction between what is innate, what is divine, God-given, and what is socially constructed. And the word social just means human. It's constructed in the minds of humans, so it's not something that's innate.
So it'd be
And
like politicking, a lot of politicking and power brokering would be constructed in a sense.
yes, yeah. But it's more basic than that. It's like the idea of money is a social construct. The idea of a government itself is a social construct. A government's a social construct. The words we speak are social constructs in the sense that they don't have any meaning besides what we give to them. There's no reason that the word food means food. We just it came from somewhere, and now we decided that it means food, that it means things that we eat. And of course, there's etymology, words change over time, but that's the point of social constructs. Social constructs are not innate, so they change. They're not like laws of physics or anything. They can and do change. But when you have socially constructed institutions, these institutions that we have, what tends to happen is that individuals, their goals and their aspirations, their values get tied up in these institutions. So you have people that value the United States, they're attached to the United States, and the United States government, things like that. So they will take certain actions in order to advance within that social institution. And that social institution is going to continue to perpetuate itself. One example I like to use for this is in California, where they have this massive industry dealing with the homeless crisis. And of course, the homeless crisis never gets solved because there's people making $200,000 a year. It's a complex issue, obviously, but it's never going to get solved if there are people's jobs that depend on it. And when you extrapolate that out to a complex system, what you end up with is that there becomes fat, right? There's like fat on the bone, and this grows over time. So another example, like there's these middleman industries that we don't really need, but that continue to exist just because they have like momentum almost.
Yeah.
And
also,
they
the entire thing's a house of cards. Like if there's certain threads that if you start pulling them, this entire thing becomes unraveled.
Yeah. And sometimes it has to, because they're at a certain point, all institutions become incapable of changing. They have too much fat built into them. They're too much. They've been socially created to the point where they're socially created as well in the context of the past. So when you have a hunter-gatherer society that the power is completely contextual, there's not layers of social constructs to deconstruct. And this is a concept in political science of constructivism, but it applies here. Is that like there are layers of rules that we have that we can't go out of and we can't get rid of. So these legacy systems that we have just continue to perpetuate themselves, even though they no longer serve their purpose and you can't get rid of them. And I think that's where the collapse of of societies comes from, is when they're created for a certain purpose, they grow like, the insurance industry. We don't really need a lot of the insurance industry anymore, especially with like something like health insurance. Health insurance got to the point where, like, I'm from Connecticut. You get rid of health insurance, the entire state is screwed. Like we're the insurance capital of the world. The state we'd be destroyed. You get rid of oil, Saudi Arabia is screwed. UAE is screwed. Like, it's these industries that just end up perpetuating themselves. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that government healthcare is the answer, because it isn't. It comes with its own issues, as we see up in Canada and what Canadian healthcare has become known as.
It's really bad. Yeah, I live up here. I live in
you're Canadian.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I'll hear Americans talk about it a lot, because some people want to say it's not so bad. It actually is that bad. And the trick is that most people in their 20s and 30s probably have never had any sort of relationship with the healthcare industry, unless you had some serious illness early on. Like it exists as a hypothetical. You don't really start dealing with this entire thing until you're in your 40s or 50s and whatnot, unless you've had someone who's had cancer or had a stroke or something. Then you start to see the wait times. Then you start to see that, I'm actually paying for more things out of pocket that weren't included. I won't go into that whole thing, but it's an absolute mess. And to your previous point, I would say that a good, let's say a sizable percentage of our economy is made up of those jobs, at least where I am in Canada. A great amount of white collar jobs are like this. And I'll speak to my industry in marketing and advertising, especially in advertising agencies. There's one conversation no one really wants to have, and that's the conversation of data legitimacy. there's a lot of big name content creators and brands that are noticing that nearly every platform is lying about their data attribution. They have a huge problem with bots, and no one's trying to solve it. In fact, Twitter and X are probably the only ones that even have tried. TikTok is like half bots, and no one wants to talk about that because there's so much money changing hands. And if anyone really starts a conversation about how the numbers don't make sense anymore, then some of the biggest agencies, some of the big, like most people work in marketing where I am. That's where young people end up because they can't work anywhere else. You just get you have a degree in I've known people with degrees in anthropology who ended up working in advertising agencies just because that they'll hire anyone with any degree. And it's some kind of money. But if those go away, then it turns out nobody has a job and they can't do that. So we just keep this strange shell game going. Everyone kind of knows it's fake. No one really knows what they do anymore. They know they go to meetings and send emails. They don't even know they can't understand the design of the machine they're a cog in anymore, but we're just kind of going with it. And I think people are starting to notice that, at least, again, in my industry, there's a huge game of musical chairs. Everyone's going to figure out who's actually going to make money from anything anymore.
Yeah. And this is it applies everywhere. It applies to the individual companies. It applies to the industries themselves. There's people inside those companies, inside those industries, whose livelihoods is intertwined with them. And that's fat. It's fat. And eventually it continues to work if this system continues to produce the things that we need it to do, which it does. Like, you go to a defense contractor, they're still making defense contracts and they're still selling them and they're still using that to bully the rest of the world. And the West does that in general. I'm not saying just the US or Canada, but we're intertwined through political means with these other places and through all this trade, and liberal democracies, whatever that means now, because it doesn't mean what it meant in the past, but they want to perpetuate themselves. And the thing is, though, it eventually it has to fall down, right? Because they are social constructs. They're not innate or divine. They have to end. And it's just a matter of when it gets to the point when it actually will collapse. Because obviously, if it started like it is now, it wouldn't make any sense to anybody in any society that it was imposed on. But it's only gotten to this point because it was able to gradually change.
Yeah, and this is where the accelerationists come in. Primarily the tech accelerationists is what I'm talking about. But there is there's an operating system running in a lot of movements right now that says that we actually can break out of the gravitational force of nature if we just keep accelerating and investing capital faster and faster. And if you are, or anyone who's listening is a subscriber to modern monetary theory, that's kind of what it's all about. It's that, I don't want to get off on the whole thing, but maybe this ties into the network state. But and I'm not even saying I am advocating for this, but I'm just saying there's a lot of people who believe in this, and there's a lot of decision makers who are operating as if this were true. So modern monetary theory, for people who don't know, I actually don't disagree with its premise, which is that ever since the American dollar became decoupled from the gold standard, it's fiat currency, which means you can basically do whatever you want with it. And I won't get into the details of it too much and bore people, but basically the theory that you can create infinite credit forever. And as long as you apply that credit and open those spigots over industries that can scale and absorb it, then there is no reason to believe that you can ever stop growing. And there's a lot of individuals who believe this. And you can apply this not only to economics, but also human lifespans. This is the longevity movement, if people want to look that up. People who, the Ray Kurzweil is into this as well. He's saying by 2045, we will start to see the first human being that can live to 250 years old. Whether I believe it, that's the thing, that the conversation that's happening, the discourse around this isn't even from a positivistic point of view. You got guys like Nick Land who are taking the negative view by saying that nothing human survives in the future and everything's just a gray goo, which I actually agree with. but you'll notice that the tone that people discuss this in is more of inevitability. You hear that word inevitability a lot. Even Ray Kurzweil, the originator of this, singularity movement, saying that this is going to happen. There's nothing you can do to stop it. It's almost like we mentioned Rocco's basilisk, that thought experiment that says any sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence in the future will punish people who are not directly responsible to bringing it into reality. So you have a duty to try and bring it into reality for your own survival. It's just a thought experiment, but that's the way a lot of people are viewing this. Like, we need to do this. What else can we do? Because if we stop, we die. And they're kind of right about that. So just for people who are curious, like, what do you mean opening spigots over the industries that scale? Well, these would be artificial intelligence. These would be quantum computing, renewable energy, whatever form that takes. It doesn't necessarily need to be wind. I think those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head. Then the galactic travel would be somewhere in there as well, which is why so many people are speaking so seriously about populating the stars as a financial strategy. So again, even if you don't advocate for it, that's happening. There's people pursuing that.
Right. And it's these runaway social constructs, because when they get to the point, like these ad agencies, I think you were talking about this in your episode, like they are started by people that really care about this. Illegitimate Scholar will never be a massive company that a bunch of people work for, because it's not designed to be. Although I guess if that were ever to happen, then it would happen. But
there's an argument that shouldn't be. There's an argument that if you get too big, you're destined to mutate it into this other thing. Like, there is sort of like a Dunbar's number to an organizational size that I think, like, I'm telling you things you already know, but you actually don't want to get too big. Right. You would not want to be a publicly traded company.
No. Like, I would, like, I'm going to be hiring people soon, but like, it's, I would never go public. I would, like, there's certain boundaries that you cross, and like, if you're a CEO at the company that you started, you're no longer in control. Like, you're an employee at your own company, which I've always thought was insane. There's nothing I would trade for that. If you're at the point where you can become a publicly traded company, there's more money in just your situation already than I could ever want. So I would never do that.
Yeah. And one other thing, and I was just in a Twitter space hosted by my good friend Jay Burden just recently. We're just talking broadly about work and organizational size. And one thing we brought up is that I worked in startups. So I not worked in, but in a marketing capacity, I was in the startup space for a few years, a while ago. And one thing that you notice, at least where I am, if your organization reaches a certain size, I think it's around, what was it, like 1,000 people, something like that, you legally need to have an HR person. And so once that happens, buddy, you got cancer. I'm sorry.
Right. And that's the socially constructed reality of, like, the rules we have in our society, like the government institutions that create these laws that benefit certain people and then don't go away because they benefit the right people in the right places who would lose if they got rid of it. So it's never going to happen. Just like we're never going to get ranked choice voting or reform on the insider trading in the United States, which by like politicians, which I'm sure happens in Canada as well. I would be amazed if it didn't.
Well, and this is one funny thing about that Trump election against Biden. A lot of people very fairly pointed out that the numbers were, unrealistic and weird and kooky. But the problem is, if you start pulling that thread, you have to prove that Trump's first election also wasn't fraudulent, and then Obama and Bush. Like, the problem you don't know where that problem actually begins with fraudulent voting, with mail-in ballots, with not checking IDs, with just inventing votes. Like, there's no reason to believe it just started in that election. And so the reason I don't think even Trump people really support it was because it's like, I don't know how far we have to go back with this, and maybe the entire democratic system just unravels, and they don't want to do that. So that's why that kind of stopped.
Right, because they're connected to the system. And like, I'm publicly against democracy. Like, I don't believe in it, but at the same time, like, if I don't see any way out of it that doesn't end in mass death. So it's for my people, for
I'm the same way. Yeah.
yeah. Like, what am I supposed to, like, I'm not going to try to end it. Like, things aren't bad enough for that. Things are very bad, but they've gotten bad very gradually. And I have food on the table and I'm relatively safe. So like, I'm not going to do anything. And I like, if things got to the point where like somebody was really trying to end it and it really like, you'd have to reevaluate in that situation. But like, it's when things get more serious, people show their true colors, and like the things that matter change, and the things that like, it's just an ideological thing. I digress. Get away.
Well, it's interesting that when we're talking about that book, A Collapse of Complex Societies, the reason I'm so interested in that, to the topic you were just discussing, is I can see that realistically occurring in Canada. Not so much in America, because the American infrastructure is too strong. What works in our favor up here is that our infrastructure is very, very weak. Our population is low. We are running on fumes. We don't have the police to police us. It's actually just an utter show up here. Canada's been infiltrated by the Chinese government for something like 40 years. Like it's kind of a joke. So what that means is that if we were to step down, we actually could realistically step down from the level of a complex state into something like the provincial provinces, and then even something like tribes, if you actually had those set up, because, you know, we tend to be a very censorious nation, but we just don't have the ability to censor that much. CSIS, which is our intelligence apparatus, is kind of seen as a joke within the Five Eyes network. I don't know if you were being sarcastic there before about the China, but yeah, we've been basically. No,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really, really bad. We did a couple of clips on this, covered a few books on this. There's two fronts of Chinese intrusion. One is just straight through the Chinese Communist Party, through real estate purchases. Back with Pierre Trudeau and a few other prime ministers were trying.
We just call him Prime Minister Blackface. Oh, you're talking about Prime Minister Blackface dad.
Yeah, but his hilarious, his charmingly racist son. Like, on paper, I should love this guy.
Yeah, but, seriously.
It's funny. Let me just say for the record, if people don't know, Trudeau was caught in blackface on two occasions. And when asked, he couldn't tell you how many he had done in the past, which means it's somewhere between 2 and infinity.
Yeah, it's a lot. And by the way, he dressed up as an Arab guy with shoe polish black on his face, which doesn't make any sense. They're like pretty white. But like, the fact that he did that is funny as hell.
Yeah, just getting it wrong too. Like, yeah, rules.
Yeah, I often say, because I do anthropology, that I study anthropology so I can be racist more accurately.
And also, it's like, he's recently divorced. He's got divorced energy. That's pretty cool. Like, if he came out drunk, maybe I vote for Trudeau. But Canada has a long history of brokering a pretty aggressive relationship with communist China, even with Mao Zedong, to spite America, because we wanted to pursue our own trade relationships. And that opened the doors to the Chinese spy network in our academic institutions. But then what doesn't get brought up a lot is the infiltration of the Hong Kong triads, who work hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party. And what doesn't get brought up a lot was China is responsible for something like 96% of the fentanyl trade in North America. I'm talking America and Canada.
Yeah.
And they will broker deals with, cartels and whatnot, but they like manufacture the fentanyl and distribute it through Canada, through BC, and launder their money through Vancouver and British Columbia casinos. Anyway, this is like an open thing. People know this. Right. And we just don't really do anything about it. And then China's been buying up, valuable and essential property all throughout North America as well, that, I don't know, people don't seem to give. Like, I understand why people ideologically, they might support China because they're anti-America, because they feel betrayed by America. So they like anything that hurts their oppressor. Like, I hear you, but I'm like, you don't understand how much you're going to hate China more China doesn't like you.
Mhm.
And, you know, same thing with some other nations on Earth that people side with. They don't like it. It would be way worse for you.
Yeah.
My co-host used to live in Hong Kong for something like 10 years, and he can tell you stories that'll turn your hair white about the China tries to get away with.
Yeah, I'm not much of a China hawk, but I definitely don't find them like I find the way that the United States and Canada and other Western governments like talk about China to be like inaccurate in like what their issues with China are. Like the thing I'm not even going to get into Taiwan, but I know about the drug thing, and when people are in positions like they don't even have to be ideologically aligned with the Chinese government. It's like it just takes somebody who's going to make some money off of the deal, and it can be detached from it, especially if they're moving through like some shell company, which I assume they are. So I assume most of this is just like, you know, there's nobody in charge who can stop it, even though it's bad for everybody. There's like nobody in the right position that can actually stop it from happening, and nobody's going to put their neck on the line to stop it because other people are benefiting from it, and they're then incentivized to stop it themselves, like some other random person.
Yeah, and that's very often what's happening in Canada. Like it's a mess up here, and so that's why I was saying that if you pay attention to Canada as a case study about what could possibly happen, you can sort of game this out where the Canadian state apparatus reaches a competency crisis, and we bump down into a level of lower complexity where it becomes more the provinces trying to vie for their own relationships with America or elsewhere. And then within those provinces, maybe there's a new sort of warlordism that emerges that you probably couldn't do in America, but you might even be able to do in South America.
Yeah. Well, let's just cut a deal early, and we'll give you California, Oregon, and Washington, and you give us Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan.
You don't get the good ones. You don't get to take the good stuff.
Sorry. Yeah. You can. Well, I assume you're in Ontario.
We're already mostly California.
Yeah.
Minus the good weather.
Yeah, yeah. It's honestly, it's great that you have the French up there to unify with the rednecks, which is a really good point towards like you don't have to convince somebody of your point, and you can't usually convince somebody away from your point if it's a serious enough argument. You just have to align their incentives with your own, and like in the context of like, you know, these governments and with the US dollar and everything terrible that the United States government and also the Canadian government and whatever other governments support, you know, people have their issues with them, but there's probably not going to be a bunch of people protesting something if it heavily benefits the United States, which will heavily benefit the majority of the population. And there's a ton of examples of like this, like the cobalt mining, and the historically the banana wars in Latin America, it like the way that certain protests are dealt with and somehow certain others are not, that type of thing.
So that's a good point, and I sometimes get in trouble for bringing this up, but you know, one of the concepts I love borrowing from the left, specifically the later 20th century Marxists, is the concept of a superstructure. Curtis Yarvin kind of reworked that into the idea of the cathedral. There's maybe other versions of it, but you know, Marxists will look, because Marxists are trying to engage in revolution at every single level of society, on the religious and the traditional and the ideological. But so they look at society as this giant organism that does not actually permit any sort of rebellion that truly hurts it. And that means that any rebellion, any rebellion or revolution that seems to exist that is permitted by the system either is neutral to the system or in fact helps it, which logically checks out in my view.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting idea. I you know, I'm not somebody who has like, I don't have that many ideological backbones. Obviously, I'm like nominally in the dissident right, but that's mostly because I align with them on a lot of things, and they'll listen to me talk, and they want to talk to me, and I like everyone in it. So but I do have a lot of like, I have nothing against taking ideas from Marxists and learning from them. And there's plenty of people like Malcolm X that obviously I'm diametrically opposed to a lot of his views, but I like Malcolm X for being what he is. And I think his writing is very interesting and compelling. I got away from myself though. What were we talking about?
We were talking about not being afraid to borrow ideas from people that you might be ideologically opposed to. And I would encourage people to do that. Like, you don't need to be allergic to a lot of these ideas. There's a lot of good stuff in there, especially, for all of its faults. People say like Marx was an idiot. I don't think he was an idiot. I might disagree with some points, but there's a lot of economic critique, and there's some economic ideas that did not exist before he started describing them, and a lot of later ones. Just kind of like psychology. Yeah. A lot of people hate psychology, they hate psychiatry, they hate Freud, and they hate Freud because of the strange Oedipal complex sort of stuff. But they forget that Freud pioneered the very idea of the subconscious. So there's a lot of ideas that Freud gave us that are so worked into the zeitgeist that we kind of forget that there was a time prior to him. And I don't think most people would debate that there's such a thing as the subconscious, really. I'd be curious to hear what you say, but there's a lot of stuff in there that, for all the reasons I might not like Freud, there's some stuff in there that's good.
It's like all these people are in the context of their time. Like, we look back in the history and we like somebody like Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. But at the time, he was a left-wing radical. And if he were alive today, he'd probably be like doing beat poetry or something. So the, on the topic of Marx and like these historical figures whose ideas, like, they get mutated into this thing and they get exposed to these different environments and they get created. Like Marxism in China, you have Maoism, which is very different from Stalinism, which is very different from like Tito's Yugoslavia, which would be the one where I would think like I would have the most positive view of. And then you have something insane like Pol Pot in Cambodia, which is very hard to actually call communism even. It's like, that wasn't real communism, but most of the time it's like the idea stretches a little bit, you still call it that. Whereas Pol Pot's was insane, that it was nominally communist, but there's nothing communist about it. It was just crazy. But Marx would be horrified by all of the iterations of communism that came just 80 years out of his death and all those since. Just as Adam Smith would be horrified by what capitalism is, because it's not what he intended. And they were all created in the context of their time. I don't blame Marx at all for the criticisms. He has a lot of great criticisms about capitalism, especially because like what we have today is very different from like the 1890s. Like some of there's a, I should find this citation, but there was a freed slave, and he was, they asked him, he was working at a coal mine, and they asked him about like what it was like to be a coal miner versus being a slave. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, I know what it was like to be a slave and what it was like to be a free man. And I can tell you that I feel now working at this coal mine the same that I did then. And he's saying that I feel like a slave here. It's not different. And that speaks to like, that was the situation. And there's worse stories that I know about. The coal mines were bad. Like there were actually actual fights, and that's just the worst example that people bring up. But a lot of work was really bad then. And it was this new system that was being created, this new industrialized system.
Yeah,
and
like mass manufacturing, mass production. And I think, like you said, contextually, you need to reframe like Marx and many others viewing this as an evolving trend and saying that, okay, people are losing their humanity in here. Human life is being devalued more than I've ever seen before. Like, what is this? And can we apprehend this phenomena scientifically? And that was an attempt to apprehend this new thing. And I think there was something exciting about that. And maybe there's something exciting about that still. And I don't, I've said this a few times before, and it's kind of a vague statement, but I don't think, and maybe this will lead to our discussion of the network state. I haven't seen a similar ideological capturing of the zeitgeist like that, by which I mean there hasn't been a true apprehension of the information age, which I do see as distinct from just the mass manufacturing industrial revolution age. Like we're in such a different mind-bending phase shift right now that I don't even think we've really, like, the closest I think we came was Marshall McLuhan. And we've been discussing Marshall McLuhan a lot on our show, and some other people in our spaces as well. Prudentialist, a good friend of mine, also discussed that. And I was on his show, in fact, to talk about it. But there's not a metaphysical or philosophical approach. I think that's why people like Nick Land so much, and I mentioned him previously, but he's another guy that I think is as close as we're getting to, like, really trying to draw a circle around this whole thing we're experiencing right now and what that means to, like, our souls.
Yeah. This is a really good point. And I'm going to look up this guy, Nick Land. And that's why it's so exciting to be, like, in the space that we're in right now, because we are in an unprecedented situation, just like the Industrial Revolution was. And it's arguable that our situation is even changing faster and more drastically than it did then. And these new situations, these new paradigm shifts and ways of looking at the world and interacting with the world. How old are you, if you don't mind?
Oh, by mid-30s.
Right. You're in your mid-30s, so we're both millennials. I'm a younger millennial. I'm like 29. I'm on the cusp. But we're the last analog generation, and I think that matters a lot, because children at their younger age is every year, diminishing how much of it has an effect on you, because it's a smaller proportion of your life. So what you do as a baby and a young child, it really, really matters pound for pound more than what happens in the future. And because of that, people get acculturated to a certain setting. And when you then grow up in a world that's completely different, and the institutions of your world are built for a past world, then that requires serious, significant change. And so, all of these new movements, like, we can talk about communism, fascism, whatever, that's the past. That already happened. So whatever we have into the future is going to be something completely new, which is going to be inspired by and have, like, traces of what was in the past, just like our road widths are based on the Roman Empire, right? Like, or railroad tracks are based on the Roman Empire. It's that type of thing in a less literal, more intangible sense. This is what happens. There are echoes of the past in what we do in the future, but it's always something new for that new situation. And very rarely, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Can anyone actually predict what's going to happen? Because the new situation is so complex, and it's so, the interacting factors are so diverse, and they're so new, and they're so broad, that nobody can have a complete picture of what's going on. It could be the water crisis in Ethiopia and Egypt that kicks off the next, like, big thing. We just don't know.
You might be able to forecast some things, but whatever it is, you're not really going to see it coming unless you're paying very, very close attention and filtering for a lot of data in very, very specific ways. And one thing you'd mentioned there about, communism as an example, but we can even use fascism, that there's nothing, and sometimes I get in trouble for saying this because there's a lot of fans of both who listen to, my show. Mm-hmm. But, these are more fandoms now. We seek refuge in them because they're familiar, and we understand that world, and we frequently, the communists especially, have trouble mapping that onto the present world. But we like it anyway, people are fandoms for everything, really. And that's fine to a degree, but you have to realize it's not applicable, really. And you can learn from it, certainly, as you should learn from history. But you need to figure out what works for the present circumstances. And it won't be these things that you just kind of think are cool or funny or, comfortable. Like, people still, this might be a big swing, but, there's no individual right now that really thinks in terms of class consciousness. No real person. Only ideologues do. You can understand like there is a class aspect to it, but the idea of uniting everyone across multiple identities just along class lines, it's not going to work. You can like it. There's a poetry to it. I understand it, but the average person isn't going to go with you down that. So you can either evolve or die. I don't give it because I don't agree with them. So they can do whatever the they want and keep prancing around and trying to, just evolve out of the water and can't. But, for the rest of us on this side, I think there's real conversations about let's borrow what actually worked and craft something new that's not just leveraging the old iconography. And it needs to be something that is vital and interesting. And I think from an anthropological point of view, from the development of peoples, I think that's the correct way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's whenever there's a new context, it's something completely new that's made of the old. And I think you're entirely right. And I think it is both fascists and communists, and those are the two extreme examples, but there's a lot of that still today. And those people, like anybody that thinks that the United States is going to become a fascist country a la like Nazi Germany or like Italy, it's not going to happen. We're not going to go into communism either. It might have some inspiration from it, but it's not happening.
Yeah. And for
it just
people
doesn't make any sense.
Who are wondering, there might be some of my listeners who are punching their screens, but unless I mention this, that even communism and fascism are far more alike than you would think. National Socialism and communism, like the Marxist critique and their understanding of what needs to be reworked in society is more extreme, and fascism tries to affirm more tradition. But both of these seem to emerge from the liberal tradition. They have more in common than
from an industrial society.
Yeah, exactly. And both of them have far more in common than any of them do with the truly traditional society. And this was the critique of people like Evola and René Joinan, who said, like, you think you understand traditionalism, but you are locked within a liberal framework, and you can probably never escape it.
Yeah. It's all within a liberal framework. Obviously, both fascists and communists would not want to be called liberals, but even if they reduce as much of it that they can, whatever they create is still going to be born out of liberalism. So it's still going to have all of that in it. It's just built into it because it's built into the people.
Yeah. And that's why, we even go deep in our show into the past. We started talking about Julian Jaynes and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. We talked about the ancient city by Pustel de Calange. Like, once you understand how ancient people lived, it's a foreign country. It's a different planet entirely. Like, if you went back in time, not only could you not communicate with them, like, you wouldn't comprehend things like they do.
Right.
And that's, I'm saying that's as a value statement. I'm not saying that's bad or good. It's just, you don't understand how different a truly traditional society was.
There was a moment during my anthropology undergrad, this was years and years ago, where I was reading all these books, and a lot of my classes were cultural anthropology, which is what my niche is, anthropology of religion, like indigenous cultures, things like that. And there was a moment where I was reading this book or this article about magic and what magic means to these indigenous cultures. Most of them, indigenous has become like kind of a political term as well, but I should say like primitive hunter-gatherer, like this cultures that have magic more than in just like baseball or something. Like, it's this idea of these intangible things, that this energy force, animism. Most traditional hunter-gatherer and even pastoralist societies are going to have like some level of animism in them. It's very common in human history across every single continent, where every living thing, animals, or like even a lot of the times, even like inanimate objects like rocks and places in the ocean, they have energy and they have power. And this is something that I now believe in fully. But I was reading this book about this sorcery, where like these people think that someone else has cast a spell on them in a negative way. And there's lots of evidence that there are very real physiological reactions in people. But I'm reading this and it like clicked for me that, and this is an idea that happened in my head. So me saying it is not going to have the same effect, but it clicked for me that sorcery and magic is real, because even if it's something that people don't believe in, other people believe in it, and it has a real effect on other people, which spreads out. And I'm not explaining this well. I can't move this from my brain into anything.
I can jump in there because
please.
This is where I'm at. I agree with that, and I'll give a couple of examples. My good friend is by the name of Stormy Waters. He's on Twitter, and
I know Stormy.
Yeah, you know Stormy. So we're in the same chat there, and he was going off one time about it might have even been with you actually, talking about how like they've conducted experiments in short, it's that when someone was focusing on another person from 5-10 miles away through a telescope, that person could feel that there was some kind of attention being paid to them, and they could tell this physiologically because they were hooked up to machines. And I don't know the veracity of that experiment, but
there are some anthropological studies I could share on that as well.
So there's this idea that you can feel in the ether and the cosmos, whatever it is, that something is directed at you. Call it energy, call it whatever the you want. And I arrived at these conclusions almost from the opposite perspective, a non-spiritual perspective, but from a scientific perspective, where if you get into things like information theory, if you get into quantum mechanics and you understand sort of the strange relationship between particles, and people, once you go down far enough in the quantum realm, they'll start using terms like operating system or programming. This is where simulation theory comes from. It's like, what if the universe is a simulation? Well, your DNA has a genetic code. What do you mean by genetic code? They'll say, well, that's information. Well, what do you mean information? It's because everything in the universe is driven by this thing called information. Information is data on your computer, but it's also in your DNA, telling it what to do. Now, what do you mean it tells you what to do? What's telling that what to do? How does that make sense? And they will say that, well, there's some kind of operating system in the universe telling quarks how to spin and everything. So like there is they don't want to call it a mind. They don't want to call it some kind of unknowable life force telling them, but they're trying to encircle that in some way. Anyway, but you do get to an almost phenomenological way, and phenomenology is a very interesting philosophical area of study. Kind of like, it's almost like the opposite of the Platonic forms, where in the Platonic world, where there's this higher dimension of unknowable things that are kind of interfacing with our material realm. This is almost not the opposite, but the interplay. Like when we speak things into reality, we actually do speak things in reality, and that there's no substantive difference between the concept of an idea as it exists in your head and it existing in the universe. It's just a slightly different way of manifesting itself. But if you can consciously apprehend a concept, like the concept of a chair, that chair exists in the universe, whether or not it exists in the physical world. That's a different way of looking at it. But then you start thinking, okay, we're looking at different levels at which things can exist. Can things exist in a non-material way? And I mean exist, like really exist. Exist as if you or I or that punching bag across from me actually exists. And then, I'm doing a very, very top level view of this, but now you're saying that, okay, all this stuff exists and everything is kind of information and everything is kind of intertwined, and that it's all forms of information exchange at every level, and the physical world is just one aspect of it. So why couldn't things like me speaking something into reality and it having a literal effect also occur? Now, this is very heady stuff. This is very, maybe they would call it woo-woo or kooky, but I do think and we covered this on the show extensively, there's a mesh backing up this stuff. Anyway, that's my big long rant on that.
Yeah, no, and I'm fully with you. It's not the way that I would say it, but that's based on our different framings or different cultural understandings. Mine is based on...
You can kind of arrive at the same thing with different languages, and that's what you see when you really get into the quantum mechanical stuff. Like they're trying to describe something that would be obvious in spiritual terms and non-spiritual terms, but they're getting into the unknown and they don't know what they're looking at.
Right. Gone down so low, so specific that like when you start asking questions, you're coming to the same answers that, societies come to in different ways based on their context.
Yeah. But I also hate witches. Yeah. I don't like witches. So this is not an endorsement of Wicca or a bunch of naked bitches trying to kill me.
Yeah. Well, obviously not. Yeah. So it's like it's interesting that you get to this position from like the context of everything that you know, and I come to what I view as a very similar position, at the least from studying instead. Like the way that I look at it is I look at many, many different cultures from across the world and across different technological contexts, wherever they are. And, the aggregate of all that information of all these different people living with different subsistence strategies and different physical environments with different challenges and struggles that they're facing, like, when you know about their context, you know what that context means, and then you know about human nature and you know about how they're reacting in that context. And so you have the context, what it is, and then how they respond. And then the aggregate of all those different people that I've studied brings me to this conclusion that like knowledge of the nature of humans in the sense that how they're going to respond in any given situation when different humans have responded to certain situations in certain ways in different contexts. God damn, that is not going to be fun to listen to.
I got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, people probably like that. If you're listening to this at this point, if you got this far in the episode and you're a common listener, then at this point, I think that you just want to hear me word vomit like that.
Yeah, and this is where if you had sound drops, if you had sound effects, you would drop that's illegitimate.
Oh gosh, Cleveland. I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to keep that, put that on the soundboard. All right. So you want to talk about the network state?
Yeah, sure. This is one of those books that I liked it when I read it. And I keep coming back to it. And I like anything that, even if it's inelegantly executed, which it isn't, but even if it is, if it's practical, I like it. Because it's very common in our space for people to use very highfalutin language to say, like, you know what we need to do? We need to get together. We need to do this. We all need to collectivize and re-tribalize. But like, maybe this is me being a dunderheaded oaf, but I need it spelled out very clearly to me. Like, what do you mean? What does that look like? How many people are involved? Like, what are we doing? Tell me what we're doing, because a lot of us have been at this for a long time. This space is very well documented, and we've been having the same conversations for a long time. So what's the next thing? And there's a lot of people, listeners of my show as well as yours, I'm sure, who are like, okay, like they're burned out from a lot of the cyclical discourse and the perennial topics. It's like, what do we do from here? Someone give me a plan. I don't need a leader. I just need an idea. So what I liked about this was, here's an idea. And it's called the Network State, and it's by an individual. I'm going to up his name. It's unforgivably Indian. It's Balaji Srinivasan. Sure, why not? But this is, I found that the book was written in a style very familiar to people who understand what the NRX sphere was, the neo-reactionary sphere. So people remember that. That's your, Nick Lando is associated with that, but your Curtis Yarvins, a lot of, Dave the Distributist, a friend of mine early on. Like, a lot of people started off in that space and then just grew out of it. But it was very, very into startup culture. It was very techy. It was pretty subversive and countercultural, but these people use the word LARP a lot. They use a lot of, they love internet terminology, which kind of annoys me. Anyway, that's what I was saying. The book uses a lot of internet slang, which is very grating. However, that lets you know the priors of the author. Anyway,
right.
That having been said, The Network State, very, very long book, and you can even read it online for free. You can buy it, but if you look at like thenetworkstate.com, you can just read it. There's a whole website set up.
Yeah, I just pulled that up for those of you who are watching on YouTube, which you should be. And you get the episodes a week early for $2 on Patreon until I move the price up eventually.
Yeah.
Plug that then. So sorry, continue.
No, sorry. If you,
I'll drop the link below.
I never want to interrupt a plug. I never want to interrupt anyone making money.
$2 a month.
Yeah. And what I liked about the book is it's written in a very 21st century way. Like it starts off, there's like the network state in one sentence. Then there's the network state in 2 paragraphs. So like if you just wanted the headline, and I'll just read it right now. In one informal sentence, here's what it says. A network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. Okay, what's that mean? Well, basically, it's a roadmap for how to start your own country and how to do it in a online sort of way, leveraging online communities. And that's what I found very interesting. And you hear that and you're thinking, well, how the could you do that? Well, there's actually a pretty good plan in this book on how to do it. And I won't go through every single, version of this. I won't go through every single, because it goes into the background of like, what is a state? How can you design a constitution? But there's a lot of really interesting ideas in this book. And one that I come back to, and I just want to get this out of the way. You might find it interesting. He was talking about the concept of the left and the right politically. And a lot of people look at that as reductive. They think, well, isn't it strange how we just have a bipartisan system? Why can't we be like a parliamentary system? Well, just to let you know, even a parliamentary system, it's like 5 significant parties, still basically follow along the left and right axis, and they just collectivize in different ways based on that. So no matter what, that seems to emerge in complex societies. And why is that? But that's something you actually need to account for. If you want to start your own country, you need to look at the mechanisms of a state. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to start a state. Why does the left and right exist? You can't start a large organization without having to reckon with that. So he was saying that this is just an axis that always exists. And you can frame this within elite theory if you wanted to, or what was that book, like The Ancient City or things like that, where it's like you have the center of power representing, the sort of the ossified control of the institutions, the monarchy and whatnot. Then you have the periphery, and there's always a periphery and there's always a center, and there's always an interaction between the two. Sometimes the periphery overwhelms the center. That's called a revolution. Sometimes the center wins over the periphery. Then you actually don't get innovation. Then you don't get the cycling in of new, exciting ideas. That's how you can get a death of a civilization. Another way, it just ossifies and becomes a museum of itself. Arguably, that could be what's happening now, depending on who you ask. But that's an idea of the left and right as this permanent relationship that you need to account for if you want to do something like start a state. So throughout the course of the book, what he says is, okay, let's start with a community. Let's start with your tribe. Who are your tribe? And what's interesting is he leaves that up to you. Some people hear that and they hear it in an ethnic point of view. And it could be. You could easily, a lot of people say, oh, this is like a white nationalist thing. Yeah, it could be. Or it could be a religious thing. It could just be, I'm going to start a tribe. I'm going to start a online nation state for Christians or Catholics, let's say. Mormons would be a good example who could probably do it, actually. And there's sort of an ethnic tilt to that as well, baked into the cake. But there's a lot of ways to do this, but you need to kind of negotiate that for yourself. And maybe there's a Dunbar's number associated with that it only makes sense at 150 people. But it doesn't need to be a massive nation like America, because arguably, America is just a conglomeration of states, which are themselves a conglomeration of tribes. which couldn't really be boiled down to 4 main population groups, depending on who you ask. That's if you're going by the Albion seed model. But anyway, the idea would be you can actually negotiate what that tribe is online, and maybe it's ethnic, maybe it's whatever. And he has this one thing in the book, and I believe this to be true, about how to kind of start your constitution or what really unites you. And he says the simpler it is, the better. And I see then that's a great comparison between America and Canada. America has a relatively short and punchy constitution. Some people think that's a bug. That's actually a feature, because Canada has an extremely labyrinthine, legalistic charter of rights and freedoms that is that just leaves the wide door open for judges in the moment to litigate however they want. There actually is no real constitution up here because it's so long, because there's so many holes you can snake through. So you actually want something that's simpler to unite you. And he has this great idea in the book, and it sounds very internet-y, but I kind of like it. The more I think about it, I like it. It's just X equals good or X equals bad. So your founding document or your founder statement for your community could be something like, just let's say this, like black people good. If you're a black nationalist, black people good. That's it. That's actually all you need. And that sounds like it's vague. It's not. You kind of want it at that level of vagueness. Or white people good. Or Catholics good. Or liberty good. Let's say you're trying to start an America within an America. Let's try, like you're trying to start like a Tea Party country. That would be a liberty good. Basic. And if you disagree with that, you can't be a part of it. And you like that, and you like the most extreme version of that. And that's kind of how you unite these people. And then the process you go from there is you start having to map yourself on the real world. And I think that's what the most interesting part of it is, which is like, okay, you have this community, you have this belief system, this value set. How do you make this real? Well, you just start buying property. And it's not even that hard to, like, again, the Mormons would be a phenomenal model for this. There's people who've kind of done this to various capacities. Some people look towards the Amish, but I think for a more modern example, look at the Mormons and look at some other groups around the world. I think that even the AFD in Germany are trying their hand at this. So like, okay, let's start communes, let's start towns and villages, and we control who comes in. And if we can own enough land and generate enough productive capacity, and the most important thing, get yourself to a position where you can't be fucked with, or it's difficult to fuck with you. And that means defenses. That means they rely on you for something. Maybe you provide some resource or something. That's good enough for self-determination, at least to start. Now, again, maybe this is more difficult in America because the infrastructure of the state is so strong, but you could do something like this in Eastern Europe easily. You could do something like this in Canada. This happens all the time in South America. I think if you wanted to go to South America and do this, you probably could. I
think there's white people in South Africa are doing this as well. There's a small group.
Fucking great example. The Afrikaners, like the Boers, all that, like that, they're doing it. That's what it looks like. But just to let you know, you could also do that here. And it doesn't necessarily need to be along ethnic lines, although that would be the obvious one. Even a friend of mine, Frody Midjord, from A Guide to Culture, a lot of people know him. He always talks about retribalization. But this is more like, what does that actually look like? What's the step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on how you get there? And I think this book provides some kind of model for how to make yourself real conceptually, how to make yourself real practically. And then it's as simple as just making yourself real in the real world as a place that owns territory. And then you can kind of build yourself to have a seat at the table. One example of this in Canada would be Aboriginal tribes. They're a great example of they're relatively small. They're centralized, but kind of decentralized, but they have their founding beliefs are Aboriginals good. That's about it. They're primarily oral culture. They don't have a lot of written laws. They didn't have a written language until like 1996. It's really sad. However, they're as potent as an entity as anything in Canada, and they can they can argue and fight for a seat at the table with the federal government. So we see this all the time. It's not necessarily a matter of numbers. It's a matter of, can you cause enough problems or represent something that a larger power would like to deal with? And they have to deal with you because it's too hard just to steamroll you. And right. I'm not going to get into details on what that looks like, but it probably involves guns. It probably involves standing up for yourself. It probably involves you can't just be, trifled with.
There was a time where Canadian military had almost an open war with the Haudenosaunee.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was like the 80s.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases where the government went to war with even the FLQ and terrorists, and it didn't do too well against them. And that could be something just about Canada. It could be that,
which is strange because Canada, usually in international warfare, they perform quite well, pound for pound.
They do. The soldiers, the human capital that it has, are very highly effective and very good. Like the soldiers, the guys who actually go in, they're very good war fighters. It's a crying shame that they do not seem to provide them the resources or the recompensation necessary to do their jobs very well. Like in my youth, every day growing up, there was some scandal about we didn't spend enough money to maintain our submarines, so they just sank in the harbor, or like we just don't take it seriously. So I think the what I would call the warrior class in Canada, a good friend of mine, Jeremy Mackenzie, would be one of those up here, the Raging Dissident. He represents a lot of veterans, same as in America. Like they're leaving the military because they're not being supported. Yeah. So you're not going to have them left anymore.
Yeah, that's my family as well. I'm a U.S. Marine veteran, and most of my dad's family is military as well. And that is true. I would not want my children to join the military at this point.
I asked Jeremy, if you want to have someone on, you want to hear a harrowing story, get him on in his conflict with the government he's involved with right now. But I asked him straight up, he had a tour of Afghanistan and Iraq, I believe. And I asked him, I talk to a young man right now. He's our age, right? You talk to a young man right now who wants to become disciplined, who really wants to maybe even defend his country. Would you recommend they go in the military? And he vehemently would say no. And it pains him to say that, I'm sure, but it's the fact of it's what it is out here. I don't think the American military might not be as bad as ours yet with the woke stuff that's going on. But I think there's a lot of guys, especially since COVID, who just don't feel supported.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of it. I'm having Gord McGill on soon, who's a Canadian trucker. He was on, what's that guy's name? Frickin' dude from Fox.
Was it Tucker?
Yeah, no. Tucker. He was on Tucker recently talking about it. I'm going to get more into the Canadian stuff. What was that guy's name?
Jeremy Mackenzie, Raging Dissident is his moniker. He has a very, very popular show. And the trucker protest is a great example because we covered that pretty extensively when it was going on. It's my sense that the Canadian government would have loved to crush that. They just couldn't. And a lot of people who are critical of populism and they're critical of just, a lot of the people protesting COVID wouldn't be as radical as me or you. They're just, basic conservatives. Yet they really put their grip around the throat of the government for a while there, to the point where if they wanted to do something extreme, they could have. And I think the government knew that. And that's just because I don't think we had the government has the boots on the ground to really stop something like that. And some people said, oh, maybe they will now. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think we hired more cops.
Yeah.
The RCMP is a joke.
Yeah, they're killing them with litigation at this point. At least the leaders of it seems like it. A lot of legal trouble. I think Gord is, I don't know if I should say fled, or his wife's American. They're in America now, but
just like January 6th, like they're just trying to make an example out of people now that they can, but they couldn't in the moment. And I think that's important to remember.
Right. All right. Well, you want to plug whatever you want to plug, and I think we're good on that. I loved everything you said about the network state. I have several notes, but we'll have to do it another time because I could fill a whole episode with it.
I'd love to. People check it out. It's a really interesting book. You might not agree with all of it, but I think at the very least, it's a starting point for people to wrap their heads around that. You don't need to wait for the apocalypse to start thinking about these things. And everyone in our scene is always talking parallel societies. We have to start alternative versions of this or that. I'm like, well, here is a conceptual roadmap to how to start doing that. And there are people who are doing it right now. And we don't need to shine a spotlight on any of that, but just let you know, if you are the type of person who's interested in parallel societies or creating something outside of the system, I think this is a good place to start, and I'll just leave it at that because I know it's late over there too.
No, that's all right.
So if people would like to know more about me, if you liked what you heard, check out bloodsatellite.ca. That's the best place to find episodes of Blood Satellite, clips and links. And we're on Patreon and Gumroad. And we have a sister show called Real Secret Coffee Hours, which I do. And that's a whole separate show where we go over, Substack ideological beefs. Usually we talk about Substacks that are like in opposition to each other. We did one where it was Academic Agent responding to Keith Woods. Let's talk about the ideas, not just the drama, but like what are these conflicts about? And there's a lot of them in our space. So if you've ever wanted to know a bit more about HAPA perspective versus Endeavor from, Morgoth and Endeavor on the Second Amendment, things like that, give that a shot. It's good fun. And I'm on Twitter @LegallyIronic. We're on YouTube too. Look us up on there.